This episode gets real, and I know will resonate with so many of you. My next guest has been on a journey in which she used poetry to process grief, to heal her heart, and to emerge as her most authentic self. Listen in to hear her story. Welcome to this episode of She Made It. I am your host, Elle Zimmerman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Clara.
Hi, Elle. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, this was a really lovely conversation. Our guest, Danielle Benett Simmons, is a poet, but she's so unique in that it's just not poetry in the written word, it's poetry as a performance. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people call it spoken word artist or beat poetry, but she refers to herself as a poet, but beautiful presentation of her incredible use of words. I'd love for you to share how you, because you sort of introduced us to Danielle.
Yeah, so I found out about her and her work through Story, which I believe I've talked about before. It's this amazing conference in Nashville that brings creatives and storytellers together. So that's how I found out about her. But what really drew me to her and sort of caught my attention was, one, her beautiful poetry, which resonated with me a lot, but also that she also works full-time in a corporate but very creative career. So I just love bringing people on the show who aren't full-time artists, but are really passionate about it and do it as part of their life too. So that's why I wanted her to share her story on the podcast, because I knew that that would be something different and an interesting take for She Made It.
Yeah, and how she uses her art as a means of healing.
For sure. Yeah, that's a beautiful part of it too.
Yeah, and I'd love to share with our listeners, because a lot of the conversation with Danielle sort of kept circling around, how will my life have meaning, and what is the vision for how I want to contribute, how I want to create. And so I'd love to give our listeners the opportunity to get access to my Meaningful Vision workbook. You can go to lzimmerman.com/downloads, and it's how to create a meaningful vision. It works you through some reflective exercises, but also with that future purpose, joy, fulfillment in mind.
Yeah, this is a really powerful exercise, so I highly recommend it. Elle, before we dive into your conversation with Danielle, do you want to share a little bit more about who she is?
Yeah. So Danielle Benett Simmons, she is, as Clara said, a strategist. She's an analytical creative. She has worked in a big church. She has a master's in education. She has been a professional poet for over a decade. And she believes that poetry is a cathartic tool and storytelling vehicle. So story comes into her work now in the corporate sector. So she teaches poetry, but when it sort of shows up in the corporate world, she works for a company called Shareability. So it's an agency that brands use to increase their visibility, but again, all through words, storytelling. So it's really inspiring to hear how she merges the personal passion and that professional vocation. Welcome to this episode of She Made It. I'm your host, Elle Zimmerman, and I am here with my lovely guest, Danielle Benett Simmons. Hello, Danielle.
Hello, Elle. How are you?
I am great. Danielle, where are you calling in from today?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Ooh, what part?
I'm on the west side near the beach. I live in Playa Vista.
Yeah, I know Los Angeles is very spread out. My husband actually is from LA. He grew up in the Torrance, Redondo Beach, Lawndale, that part of LA.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's not too far away.
Yeah. And so is that originally where you're from?
No, I am a DC native. So I grew up just outside of Washington, DC in Northern Virginia, but I have called LA home for almost 15 years now.
Yeah, bi-coastal.
Yes. But I miss the East Coast. I miss the seasons.
Yeah, we're right in the middle of spring emerging. It's a beautiful time of year.
Where are you guys located?
I'm in Cincinnati. So
Oh, okay.
kind of in the heartland. People think of us as the Midwest. We're really actually closer to the East, but we still get the four seasons. So
Yep.
yeah, it's a great place to raise a family. My family was here, and I ended up studying at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. So I stayed in this area, and it is a great city to raise a family. So that became kind of the priority for us. So yeah.
Yeah, certainly more green.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's far more green than there is in Los Angeles.
Yes, but we don't have an ocean in Ohio. So
Very true. Very true.
yeah, so I'm so excited about our conversation today, Danielle. I've never met you, and it's fun to have conversations with women that I've admired, and I've watched your work, and I've followed a little bit of your journey on the outside, and now I get to know a little bit about the inside. And what I have really grown to love about what you share is on Instagram, you share a lot of your spoken word poetry, and I'm so curious how I like to start conversations with people like, where do they start this creative journey? And one of the questions that I actually jump into is, what is your first creative memory?
That's really interesting. I have a really vivid memory of writing a story in my grandfather's house's basement. I wrote a short story that was like really imaginative, and I don't even really know why. It's not like I was a particularly avid reader. But I remember being really excited to write it, and it was probably not very good. But that was my first creative memory, I think.
And do you know how old you were?
Oh God, I have no clue. I mean, little. I must have been, I don't know, 6, 7, 8.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing how many women that I ask that question to have a story related to a grandparent.
Really?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, the nurturing of that creative soul that starts with our grandparents.
Yeah.
And how did that? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say my second, the next memory I think I could grab with my grandfather was also sitting there, and it involved playing with Legos.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So cool. And were you always drawn to poetry?
To be honest, probably not. I mean, I liked it a lot in school. Like I liked poetry in English class. I liked it. I liked helping to dissect it. I by no means felt like I was an expert. And actually, when I was a senior in high school, a couple of my closest friends were the editors for our lit mag, and I was like, you know what? I like writing. In 8th grade, my English teacher read my poem out loud as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and like share a little bit of the closet writing I've done. It was not a lot of closet writing, just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I submitted and didn't get in.
Oh, that's funny.
I got rejected.
Every great step out requires a huge failure, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. Yeah, so give me a little like sort of the journey to your creativity. Were you like, was it the performing of the poetry? Was it the writing part of it? What was sort of the spark? What was the birth of it?
Well, it comes not so long after the getting rejected by the lit mag. I right after my senior year moved out to LA to go to college, and I remember I was at a conference where there was a spoken word artist performing at this conference. And I remember looking at that person and saying, that's me. I just knew it. Like I'd been doing public speaking at that point since I was in middle school in one way or another. And I had loved to write. I think when I was in elementary school, I'd wanted to be an actress, and I gave up that dream around middle school. But I knew that there was something so authentic and powerful about that art form. And after seeing that, I made a couple inquiries to people that I knew at the conference and asked where in LA I could see more of that or practice more of that. And so I went with a group of people eventually to LA's largest spoken word venue and one of the country's longest running spoken word venues. It's called the Poetry Lounge in Mid-City. And that's kind of where I wouldn't say that my creative journey was birthed there, but that is certainly where my poetry journey was birthed. And that was my poetry family for a really long time, for as long as I could make it there on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly share. I don't think I've ever shared this. I have a very similar story about acting. Like, I remember I was probably 10 or 11 and going to some community theater show with a family friend and seeing a woman standing on the stage. You know, she was my friend's older sister, and the way the light came through the window and her in this period dress singing out the window. And I remember the same thing. I said, that's me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the closest thing I've gotten to like a very, very, very clear calling inside.
Yeah. And do you remember what she was speaking about?
It was a man, and
Okay.
I do think I remember the poem was essentially about like some sort of internal resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. I think the content feels less clear to me now, but the feeling remains just as clear.
Yeah. Yeah. And what an incredible like collaboration of the speaking, the acting, the writing, and spoken word poetry. I guess I'm assuming most people know what that is, but let's assume there are some people who have never heard of that. How do you describe it?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I had to do a lot of that, especially when I first started on the journey. Almost no one in my life really knew what that was. It's becoming so much more popular, especially after having someone like Amanda Gorman at the inauguration. But 10 years ago when I started, that was not popular at all. And 10 years before that, when the pioneers were actually making a way for a real career in the art, no one really understood. But the way one of my favorite pioneers and kind of mentors and someone that I look up to in the space explained it is that spoken word is just kind of a gimmicky term for performance poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So it's mostly about what you write. It's secondarily about how you bring it to life on stage. And when I teach poetry, that's what I try to do is we'll spend almost the entire class or course just talking about writing. Because if you have good writing, you don't need to overperform or overact or anything. You can just be true to what you wrote. And go back to the place where you wrote it from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it also helps though because I watch some of your videos on Instagram, which I do highly recommend. We'll put this in the show notes, but it's at Miss D Bennett on Instagram. You have some videos of your work, and most recently, I think you shared She.
Oh yeah, that's definitely an older.
Oh, good. Yeah,
an older hit.
So good. Yeah, there was
Thank you.
one. I mean, there's so many lines. Like the like I had to listen to it many, many times because it was so rich. There was one, and I didn't write it down, so you're gonna have to help me. But it was like when you're in the middle of a cyclone, but you know how to stay standing or something.
Yeah, she's seen the eye of a tornado enough times to know how to stay.
Yeah. And that resonated. I mean, so many things resonated, but that resonated on so many levels. And you just talk about the power of a woman and finding herself. And so it appeared, I'm kind of like jumping a little bit into now sort of like, what you wrote about, but you spoke as a woman who is very grounded and strong and has kind of been through enough to have confidence. So I wonder from what perspective you wrote that, or when you listen to it, how you feel about it.
I love that you are opening this up because that piece is been really interesting for me in so many ways because I wrote it because I was asked to write essentially an anthem for this women's event. And the way that I decided to sit down and do it, I was like, this is easy, but I need focus because I deeply believe that the detailed is the gateway for the universal, and the good writing starts with specifics, not with broad. So I didn't want to talk about women. I wanted to talk about women that I knew. And I wanted to talk about things I liked about myself, but more importantly, I wanted to talk about the things that inspired me in friends, mentors, and family, people that I knew. And so that's how I set off writing it, is that line by line, I was tying those things either to dreams I had for my own personal growth journey or to specific people I know in my life. So I would write a line and be like, that's for this friend. That's this friend. That's this friend. So that when it actually came together, it was more of a tapestry of real people, which is why the ending lands with, she is the woman you were always made to become. And look around, my love. Trust the time you chose to live with magic in your blood. Because the idea is that all these things are not this like aspirational culmination of one woman. This is what it looks like to live in community with women who are very different in their strengths and very different in their weaknesses and their journeys. So that was the beginning of the poem. And I still stick by that approach. I was really happy about it because it allowed me to read that poem live with so much conviction. And that's what I mean about staying true to your writing, and your performance it becomes more authentic. You don't need to overperform.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the journey, though, is I have had to, the original poem is like 6 minutes long. And I don't think that video actually shows the original because it was too long. I ended up cutting it down for performance's sake a bunch of times. And then as I wrote that poem, I don't know, maybe 2015, I think, something like that. And as I've been asked to perform it over the years, I've actually had to change it because some of my beliefs have changed. And so I've started morphing the words a little bit because I was actually asked to perform it at a women's event, and I fudged 1 or 2 lines for the first time in my entire spoken word career. And I have done that poem more than any other poem, and that is the first time I've ever messed up a poem live in front of people. And I realized it's because I was saying something I didn't necessarily, a part of the poem I was saying that I didn't necessarily believe in anymore.
Oh, that's really good. I mean, isn't that art? You know, it evolves, it transcends, I mean, that's really powerful. And obviously we've had a crazy last 5-6 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my life has definitely become, I've gone through plenty of things that have helped given me a deep sense of resilience and strength. But as I've gotten older, I'm also able to look back at just how much wisdom I haven't had that I thought I had. And so I think I'm proud of younger Danielle for her aspirations and for what she stood by. I think older Danielle is like, those convictions have in some places softened, in some places become more nuanced, in some places become more firm. My understanding of what it takes to heal, of what it takes to love, of what it takes to truly believe in something and live by it has evolved.
So thank you for sharing that. I wonder, would you be willing to share sort of what a certain part of it that changed? Or
Sure. Let me pull it up real quick. I couldn't probably speak to it right away because I've done so many different edits on this piece. The one that I did on Instagram that you're referring to is the older version. Here's the full one. What's one of the things that changed?
And even if you want to just give us a little bit of it, I'd love to share some of your performance of it.
Sure. So I have a couple of favorite parts, but those are, of course, not the things I wanted to change.
You could share that too.
Okay. So, well, one of my favorite parts is, it's around that skyscraper bit. I'm not sure if you remember, but she's the skyscraper we look for on the 101 that reminds us we are home. If you ask her how she got so tall, she'll show you the days she spent clearing the debris so the concrete could be poured in clean and deep. She'll show you the moons who knew her fear of heights and the morning she woke with the gumption to keep growing anyway. And I love that part.
That's good. Yeah.
I think I was like somewhat fearless for a while. Like I just had a lot more tenacity to go after things. And I think as I've done a lot more self-work and I'm a little bit more in touch with the ways that my fears show up in my life. And life has given me a couple more real things to be afraid of. I've had to face that a lot more. And so I spend a lot more time now, like waking up and wanting that gumption and being like, Danielle, where's your gumption today? The moon knows your fear, but the morning knows your courage. Like, let's Let's seize it. So that's been a really powerful inner kind of anthem for me.
And interesting that your younger self wrote it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think poetry is prophetic in so many ways. And I think poetry is a tool of the prophets. So many poets that I know have said things that, like, even if they weren't fully true in their lives yet, either felt true in my life. I mean, I think if we think about prophecy as a tool of conviction and a tool of edification, I've heard both of those things happen through the mouths of poets in a way that are profound and touching and that can stick with you. So I've seen some of that. I would say, if I'm really honest, there's some theological stuff in this piece that my theology has just evolved a little bit more from, I was used to be a little bit more evangelical, and now I'm far more mystical and contemplative in my spirituality. So there's some of those particular pieces of language that I would probably adjust.
Like the woman is the oven.
Well, no, I think women are still.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I love that line.
We birth a lot of stuff.
No, I loved that line. I'm just kind of, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. There's a line about, like, standing in a tent of a king with the permanent win. Not that I don't necessarily believe that. I just maybe would phrase that a little bit differently.
Yeah.
I still think that women are, like, we understand we have an intuitive power that is really special, and that we can sense things that we might not always be able to speak to really specifically, but we just know, like, our intuition is good, is right. But there's a line in the original that's like, she's believer of the supernatural. And I would probably adjust that line to she's believer of the mystery or the mysterious now. Small things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's I have a question about a line. I'm not sure if it's from that or not, but there was another line that really stuck out to me. I don't want to shrink so far into my smallness that it takes up the whole room.
Oh, yeah. That's from Dear Annabelle. Yeah. I was just thinking about that line last night. I like that you pointed it out. The story behind it, I love. I was, all right, we'll do the medium-sized version of the story, because this is why it was important to me and remains important to me. But I was a leader in a big church in Los Angeles, and decided after 10 years to leave that church. And that was a really, really big deal for me. And I have an incredible community of friends, both friends who are spiritually aligned and friends who are not on the same spiritual space, which is fine. But that particular spiritual friends, we were all kind of leaving in an exodus around the same time, and still wanted to cultivate something together, but weren't sure about going to other churches. So I ended up leading in a group of 12 of us that met on every week. And I was kind of the leader of this little community, but I was really struggling with how to, like, steer us in a direction when I still felt young. I didn't feel like I should be the leader necessarily, but I knew that I was. I knew I was the organizing and driving force of the space. And so I went to a friend of mine went to a temple where there was a female rabbi who I had heard interviews from, and I just thought she was the coolest, most badass woman I had seen in a while, especially leading a spiritual group. And so I went just to watch her lead this temple, and my friend ended up getting me a couple minutes to sit down with her, and I laid this out where I was like, listen, I'm leading the spiritual group, and I don't really know what to do. And she tells me this story. She's like, when I started this temple, I got up, I brought a congregation of elders together and people who were trying to help form this new temple. And a bunch of the male elders looked at me and said, your smallness is taking up the whole room. Get up there and lead.
Whoa, I just got chills.
Yeah. And she said that to me, and sometimes I have forgotten it, I'll be honest, but it always comes back with such intense conviction every time I think about that. When I was reading that line for that recording, I was like, oof, this still hits me. I still sometimes shrink so far away from myself for a myriad of reasons that I forget about the power I have and the potential I have. And that's what was happening with that small spiritual group that I ended up leading for 2 years. I would shrink and our group would look at me and say, come on, like we trust you. And I was like, oh, well, you're all my peers. I don't want to boss you around or whatever. And they're like, no, we're looking for it. Like, set the vision and we will follow. And I think that was a really hard thing for me to accept for, like I said, a myriad of reasons for a while.
Yeah. So how do you keep yourself from shrinking now?
Oh, Lord. Do I? I have a great husband. He's the person I'm around every day. So he's the person who has to bear witness to my shrinking a lot.
Oh.
So he's been really great at being like, Danielle, you're hiding, or,
so good,
you're hiding. And the inner conviction now. I choose a word every year. I'm not sure if you do that.
Yeah, I do.
I choose a word, and my theme this year, so funny that this is why that line resonates. I hadn't thought about this word in so long, but my word this year is gumption. And the goal is to stop hiding. So the reason why I've been putting out those videos of old poems, I wrote most of those poems except for one I'm going to put out in either this week or next. I wrote recently, but so many of those poems are things I wrote a long time ago. I'm just trying to like reclaim that is part of my gift, that is part of my passion, and that's part of what I like to do is write and read and perform poems, and getting back out there and not hiding anymore, even though it's just super simple and dusting off some of my old favorites.
Yeah, and we get so bogged down and we get lost and we follow a path, even though we're loving it and liking it, but we leave parts of ourselves behind if we're not careful. And so I love that, just the gumption and, one of the things, thank you for sharing that. And when I listen and I watch, it appears that you're very confident, very big, very clear. So it's helpful for me to hear that, yeah, that's the ideal, that's the best day, but there's the other days. There's the seasons that I forget these things. And, as you said, the prophetic nature of poetry reminds us who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I need to credit my community too. I have like really incredible friends who don't let me forget who I am. Yeah.
Yep. The power of community, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that really interested me, I read in your bio that this is probably going back, and it's just so interesting that you wrote your master's thesis on arts education as a venue for social justice.
Oh, yeah.
It just intrigued me.
Because I feel like you have a very, with a strong voice as a leader, you have the opportunity to influence and advocate change. And so thinking of your poetry in that way, but then arts education is a venue for that. So was that through teaching poetry? How did that show up? Or
how do you advocate for that now?
Yeah. So this is part of, this is so funny. Elle, when you guys reached out about the podcast and I noticed the title was She Made It, I was like, oh, I ain't made it.
Oh, that's so funny.
I haven't made it. My journey is not linear enough. Like there's not enough clarity. And so this is my long-winded way of coming back to your question, which was, it was the beginning of some of my world starting to intersect. And now that I've gotten farther along in my career and I'm a little bit older, I'm starting to see those intersections and just how perfect timing works out when you're just patient enough to let it do its thing. But at that moment, I had been, I became a teacher through Teach for America. Are you familiar with?
Oh yeah.
For America?
Yep.
So I became a teacher through Teach for America. And so I got into Teach for America and became a teacher. I taught 12th grade government economics in Inglewood for 3 years, and it changed my life. But as part of that, Teach for America had a partnership with Loyola Marymount, which is a college that's now right around the corner for me, where I got my master's. And you had to choose what kind of track in terms of education reform you wanted to write about. And because of my background in poetry, sorry, this is where my long story stays long. Because of my background in poetry, I felt super convicted by the fact that the arts are not, especially when it comes to schools where you're trying to remediate kids who are grade levels behind, there becomes no space in their schedule for what is typically deemed as extracurricular. So the arts, meaning music, poetry, theater, physical painting and art, those things typically are the first to get cut the moment the budgets get cut, because kids need to get caught up on math, kids need to get caught up on English, kids need access to chemistry and to physics, of course. Part of my thesis, though, was I coached and co-coached a spoken word competition team that competed regionally. And I saw that a handful of my kids who had made the teams over the years, some who were, I would not necessarily call top performers or necessarily getting the top grades in class, but maybe like were averaging C's and D's in most of their classes. There are two that come to mind in particular. When they made the poetry team, what it did for them, and I think sports can do this to some extent, but there's something about the arts in particular, what it did for their brains cognitively in how they were forced to engage with poetry and connect it to their own lives was translating into the classroom. And I saw their performance in class go up, not just in my class because I was their coach, but in other people's classes, because they were forced to make those neurological connections between content and self, which is one helpful learning mechanism for a lot of people. So that was happening. They were finding increased like metacognition between subjects and the real world. And things like poetry, things like art, they help you make meaning of those baseline subjects or core subjects like math, science, history, English in a very different way for your brain. So that was part of my thesis. I did a bunch of interviews and a bunch of research about why arts curriculum is first to get cut, and essentially making a case for the fact that particularly in underserved communities where kids are behind, they're the ones who need it most. They need additional outlets, especially to layer on top of all of that the trauma that those communities are experiencing at much higher rates, and maybe in some deeper levels of trauma than in more affluent communities. Not that there's not a prevalence of trauma no matter how much money your family makes, but the arts help heal those things, and they help ready kids to come into classrooms and actually be prepared to learn, as opposed to thinking about what might be going on outside of the classroom.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So I get it now. It's about the social justice that starts within the individual human being and the ability to like see big picture, which I think could be so valuable too, not just for the education, but for even just the path in life that often a lower income person sees for themselves, sees the future they see for themselves. I feel like the arts can sort of transcend and allow us to see possibilities. And I don't know, that is really, really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really powerful study for me. And I'm sure you can hear it. I still remain incredibly passionate about that subject.
Mm-hmm. So it leads me to a question about the internal journey that poetry provides. Like, how has writing transformed your relationship with yourself?
What a great question, Elle. It's been everything. It's been everything until it couldn't be. I will say that.
And what does that mean?
I didn't know how to process my life and things that had happened in it. I didn't know how to process what I was inheriting from my family until I encountered poetry. I remember poetry the first time I really was able to get autobiographical in a really honest way with some of my earliest work. It opened up a floodgate of me for understanding and actually looking at my life in a really focused way, in a way I was forced to search for the right language, for the right imagery. I was forced to, and I forced myself. That's what I mean by I was forced, but the craft required me to go deeper and to search for details in my own life and start to make meaning. And that became super, super powerful for me. I was just able to start to click and make connections like, oh, these addictions are real. These patterns are real. This is what I'm inheriting. And I probably exhibit all of these same behaviors. Like, how do I look at myself in a little bit more honest light? I think the danger sometimes when you get used to doing that, it was a really great tool for a while, is you realize you're getting, to some extent and for a while, applause for digging dirt up on yourself and other people.
Yeah.
Which I think is a necessary part of the journey. And I encourage people who have never done it before, like, go to town. You don't have to share your writing and what you write everywhere. But the journey is important. Like, dig up whatever you need to dig up. Whether or not you share that all over the place, use some discretion. And I have some thoughts about that. So poetry for a really long time was helping me process. So when you heard that Dear Annabelle poem that you were referencing, in terms, that's the piece with the acting so small you're not hiding. I wrote that, I think, the night that I came home from having a drink on a rooftop bar with my friend Annabelle, because I was feeling so strange. And I was like, what the heck is going on with me? And so poetry allowed me to pause and reflect and really do that in a more concerted way. And what I mean by it helped until it wasn't able to help me anymore is in 2018, I had a particularly rough year. There was a lot of family dynamics that were really difficult and coming to a head, where I had to make some choices about the way that I was going to continue to show up or not show up to certain people in my family. And then on top of that, that was kind of an ongoing theme. It involved a lot of very, very, very difficult conversations for me. And family is a sensitive thing, so I think you all get it.
Yeah.
But the more difficult part is that my father, who had been estranged from me for a long time, but we'd had some loose emails back and forth, and my husband and I or my fiance at the time, were planning on getting married. And so my husband was trying to track him down because he was going to try to invite my dad to the wedding. 3 months after he started looking for my dad, I got a call from my dad's sister saying that my dad had taken his own life.
Oh, Danielle, I'm so sorry.
Thanks. It was really tough, and it was a pretty defining experience for me. And I think if you've experienced intense and maybe kind of confusing grief, you perhaps know what it's like to be saying and thinking a lot of things, but have no words for them. And so that's what I mean by writing worked for me until it stopped working for a minute. And during that year, and probably the year that followed, reading poetry was really helpful for me. Reading good work was really helpful for me, but I just had a very tough time sitting down to process something that felt inexplainable. And since then, I've been able to write about it a little bit more, but so complex. Like, how do you explain longing for someone your whole life, even when you're estranged from them?
Yeah.
And then finding out that longing will never turn to hope. And that the next time you see the person will be, next to their coffin. That's just a really difficult thing to articulate. And I'm able to say it now without quite as many triggers, thanks to some incredible EMDR therapy. But I think that's what I mean. It's taken me a while. I went into a space where I started to experience, obviously my faith is a really important part of my life, where I just started to experience God as a God of darkness in a beautiful way. And God is a God of silence in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that the most beautiful version of the divine always has to be light. I think sometimes the gift is just to sit with us in the darkness and let us feel it all the way through until we are ready for the light to come again.
Yeah.
And so that is part of where I've been coming out of the past couple of years, is wrestling with new family dynamics, understanding what that season taught me, and wanting to really live it from an authentic place and not just from a super reactive place, about the value of life, about the importance of mental health, and how sometimes having a weekend where you just deep condition your hair, take a bath, do laundry, have a great workout, laugh a lot with my husband, maybe call a friend, that's enough.
Yeah.
And like, not writing, not performing, not posting on Instagram, not getting booked for a gig. Those things don't necessarily give me the hit that I used to chase, because that hit it just has its right place, I think, in the course of life. And I'm not that old, so I'm sure there's more to come, but that's kind of where I've been in terms of this season. But I am I don't want to stay in that place where I'm hiding behind it. I do want to come out because I do know that there is more to say and there's more to process through the beautiful gift of writing.
Yeah. Oh, first of all, just thank you for sharing. That was, I can't even imagine, the hope preparing for your wedding and this new life starting, and then this, and like you said, the lifelong yearning that is just cut short. And so I'm very sorry, and thank you for sharing. And it just reminds me of, the power of silence, and that even in our creativity, even in life, it's the valleys that bring such richness. And sometimes it's the valleys that bring us joy because we recognize joy in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the valleys that help us really value the peaks.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, my husband and I feel like we're in a really happy, we're just in a really good season. We can't stop being grateful every day.
Yeah.
And I just feel like that gratitude, it comes from such a deeper place.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it's and I just also appreciate your sensitivity to your creative self, to your emotional self, to the willingness that you give yourself, the permission that you're willing to give yourself to be right where you are, and that's enough, and that's all that is necessary, and that it's okay, it's good. And that I also really appreciate that you still feel God in that darkness, because that's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. And it's hard to give permission to yourself to be where you are. And it's hard sometimes to see God in the mundane, or to see God in the profane,
Mm-hmm.
or in the difficult. It's definitely not easy, but I think it's getting easier.
Mm-hmm. Until, the next thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I feel a little bit like better equipped for the next thing when it comes, because I think that's the biggest trick, is we just not that we need to be preparing for doomsday, but I think I've gotten caught in the trap of, one, always thinking something bad is around the corner so you can't enjoy, or two, not actually. I'll use this as a quote. My husband and I were just talking about an interview he watched with a Navy SEAL, and what they say is, in moments of crisis, you always revert to your training, which is why Navy SEALs spend 95% of their time just in training, and 5% of their time actually doing these crazy missions.
Yeah.
Because when the crazy missions come, you revert back to what you were trained. And I realized so much more how importantly, when that crisis and trauma comes, it's all of that, all of the self-work, all of the inner work comes to fruition in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So if you're not doing it during the happy times, where you're taking those moments to pause and notice your body, notice your feelings, notice your patterns, and notice your gratitude, becomes a lot more difficult to do when the tough time comes.
Yeah. Yeah. In one of your poems, you write, because you started talking about life and your weekend and your husband, and one of your poems, you write that your biggest fear used to be a settled small life. And I wonder how does that define, what is a meaningful life to you now?
I love these lines you were picking out. Because
here's the thing, Danielle. I love words. I love specificity, detail. So I'm really, really drawn to your work, because the way you put words together is so intelligent and so creative, and it makes me pause and really think. But I wonder what this means to you.
Yeah, I will answer that. And I would love to hear why it resonates with you too, because you were picking out some of my favorite bits. And they're not necessarily the hits that people will write to me about all the time either. So I think it's really interesting that you're picking out what you're picking out. And I love that the piece that you picked out too, and that's from the Dear Annabelle poem. I'll never forget, for years, my answer to what your biggest fear is, it used to be being normal.
Oh, that's how we relate.
There we go. I was terrified of being normal. And then I was in a church culture, which I'm not saying this is necessarily toxic or even horrible, but a lot of the message was big life, quit your small job and like do something big. And it's about how many people you influence and how big the people you're influencing are, and like big dreams, big global movements. And I really felt very convicted by that for a really long time. And I loved it. I loved the encouragement because it resonated so much with my sense of like, oh, can't be normal. I've had all these like high expectations spoken over my life, and I can't let these people down because, they're seeing something special in me, which I super appreciate. And there's a place for that. Everything belongs. What feels more difficult is it didn't set me up to appreciate that when you can love one person really, really well, your life is still incredibly meaningful. And your life is potentially even more meaningful than a surface level influence over thousands of people. And it took me a long time to realize that, that being healthy is really hard work.
Yeah.
And being able to find stillness is really hard work. And I used to be incredibly proud of how busy I was. I'll never forget, I had a friend who I really looked up to, who was introducing me to someone. I was in college, and he was like, Danielle's one of the busiest people I know. And I'm not just saying that, I mean it. She's one of the busiest people. And at the same time, that was producing health issues in me. My body was not reacting well to that for about 27 years.
Wow.
It wasn't until I was about 27 or 28 when I really took my health a little bit more seriously in terms of the speed and pace of my life. Because I thought that you had to go that hard. And you had to hustle that much to have a big life. And if I didn't have a big life, then it wasn't worth it.
You know what's so interesting about that is that, and maybe it's because I'm in the Midwest part of the country, most women that I live near, sort of in this part of the country, speak about religion and their church experience as making them small. And what's so fascinating is that you have this experience of being pressured to be big.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. And often, we that saying, we become the sum of the 6 people we surround ourselves with. And so there's a lot of that too. Like what voices are we hearing? Who's around us? And obviously if you're a high achiever, you're getting certain reinforcement. And but I find that fascinating. And that the message that you received was that, the bigger the better, the faster, the harder the better. And I work with a lot of women who I have to encourage to be bigger. Like they're so shrunken in, they don't feel worthy. They don't feel deserving. And, so that's just really interesting to me.
Wow. I mean, that makes sense culturally from a city perspective.
Yeah.
LA rewards people who don't stop and can be really, really big, which I think I thrive from that sense of like, oh, well, I've got endless energy, endless hustle. I can do this. And over the past couple of years, I'm like, I don't.
You're like,
know
why?
Yeah. I'm like, why?
For
what's
what?
What's the end goal? Because at the end of my days, my soul is not well, but I have become big in whatever definition you wanted to create it.
Yeah.
Then what was the point?
Yeah.
If at the end of
Well, I was to say, we could have a whole nother conversation about big, small, because we talk about the bigness, the smallness that you were faced with the spiritual leaders, the elders of the synagogue. And that's a different kind of bigness than this pushing, hustle to be big. And then you talked about gumption, like needing gumption, but yet gumption versus hustle. And, it's so, I don't know what, necessary to check in. I guess, how do we discern?
Yeah. I mean, you're spot on. you're spot on in terms of there's a paradox here that I think we need to be able to hold both and hold both healthily and not throw either out, but to hold them in proportion for what they are and to live in them in balance.
And it's hard.
Yeah,
Because the world
super hard.
sometimes
Tells us one thing, the pressure to appear a certain way versus what our heart is speaking to us.
Yes. And I think that's the power of being present to the moment too, because one moment might call for a version of yourself and another moment calls for something different. I'm not sure if you heard one of the pieces that I posted that is probably one of my favorite poems I ever wrote, was this free write. And part of it talks about Jupiter being the most magnetic planet in the solar system.
Yeah, no, I didn't hear that one. I'll have to check that out.
But what I say right afterwards is, I never want to be afraid of being Jupiter on days I feel I am made of something worth knowing. And I never want to be afraid to be the faintest star in the sky, still entirely worth knowing.
Mm.
And I think maybe that's a little bit of what we're talking about too, is like there are days where you need to be Jupiter and like let yourself be magnetic and be as big as you need to be. And that's what the moment will call for. And there are other days where we're feeling like a faint star and we got to know we're loved just right there. Or we got to yield. We have to yield the stage to someone else. And our role is to listen and applaud.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I pause. I almost don't know what to say, because that is like the heart of what so many women that I coach and speak with struggle with is worth. Where is my worth? Where does my worth come from? So that's that I should share that poem.
Yeah. I mean, good on you. That is such an important and difficult conversation. Are you an Enneagram 3?
That's funny. I was going to ask you if you were an Enneagram 4. I'm a 4, but probably with a 3 wing.
I'm a 3 wing 4.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have that whole, like, I don't want to be normal. And yet I want recognition, high achieving, but creative. That's very much that 4-3 combo.
Yep. Yeah. I'm a 3 where like I fell into leadership nonstop and then discovered the creativity part of myself and realized like that was the place I wanted to be able to achieve, was inside of creativity. Yeah, really interesting. I can hear the 4-3 in your understanding, and even your gift and ability to be able to help people see their worth, or women to see their worth.
Yeah, it's an inside job. So all I can do is kind of, like you said, you talked about a couple of the things, it's the presence, it's the self-care, it's the mindset, it's the what voices are you listening to, whose metrics are you living up to, what in your past is giving you this, this script to yourself and these patterns, and it's all so complex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And non-formulaic.
Yeah. And the kind of like the unfolding of who we are is what I love to do and help people with, is connect the dots to discover and get to know themselves better, and then step into like that more full connected version of themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're about to wrap up, but I have a question that I think our guests would love to hear. So you have this really beautiful creative side of you, poetry. I know you teach. I want people to go listen and, share what you do. But then you also have a pretty successful corporate career, and you're busy with that. Like, that's a whole nother side of Danielle we didn't even really talk about. And I guess the question that I would love to ask is, if you want to share with us a little bit about what you do and how it aligns with sort of even your creativity and your passion to, serve others and help them discover who they are and teach. But how do you combine these sides of yourself? How do you allow the creative to still be alive?
So great. For a long time, I didn't think it was possible. I just kept those worlds separate. I kept my corporate life and my poetry life like 2 separate tracks. And it wasn't until last year, or 2 years ago, I guess, I ended up miraculously getting a job at an agency that did narrative strategy. And I when I was doing my interview, the person referenced my poetry work. They were like, that's really great. That's going to really be helpful. And I was like, excuse me, what? Because I was able to tap into my storytelling background and apply it to corporate clients and help them understand like what I do when I teach, or when I'm editing someone's poem, or when I'm editing my own. I'm like, where's the poem? Like, what's the heart of it? What's the thing that's going to move somebody? And that's even when I do, like when I'm consulting too, is like, where's the heart of it? What's the part that's going to move someone? What's the turn of phrase that's going to move someone? That ended up helping a lot. And now that I work at Shareability, it's kind of the same thing. I work in strategy. Shareability helps brands come to life in a digital first and social first way.
In a what? A what?
Digital first or social first.
Digital first.
So
what does that mean?
So typically a lot of brands are thinking about, like, when they talk about getting their message across, they're thinking about billboards, big ads, huge commercials.
Oh, okay. So like is the first stream of
media
marketing.
first.
Okay, yeah. I got it.
And yeah, thank you for pausing me and backing me up there. What we're trying to help people understand is the internet is the new gatekeeper, not commercials.
Right, exactly.
So you need to be speaking to the internet and give the internet what it wants. I know. It's actually like the frameworks are a little bit more simple. It's just about shifting the dynamic a little bit and the way that you think about it a little bit. And so part of my work on that team is working with brands to advise on their storytelling structure and how you build a storytelling world. And then I also get to advise on some shorter term campaigns where there might be a brand that wants to activate a new product or wants to bring their new purpose work to life on social media. So we help with like, well, here are the inroads. This is the journey. This is the content roadmap for telling your story on social. And then of course that expands all over the place as well.
And do you do it for like product, consumer based, or are there services, people, like thought leaders?
We work. So a lot of CPG brands, a lot of product-based brands. We work with Adobe. We work with a number of telecom brands. We are working with Skittles, with Dove Chocolate, with a lot of people inside the Mars brand. We're working with a foundation called the Elevate Prize Foundation. That's one of the main accounts that I work on. Incredible foundation, founded by someone who has a lot of money and was like, you know what, I want to give this to amplify good in the world and to catalyze more good in the world. And so they award $5 million every year to 10 nonprofits. And we're helping them tell the story of how they're helping to make good famous. Yeah. So we're kind of all up and down the board, from foundations to telecom to CPG.
And here's the reason I gave you a big sigh in there is because what has happened for the small businesses is that we are competing with the kind of brands you're speaking of. You know, it's like one internet, and the big companies used to buy the big billboards, small companies didn't, and the small companies would do other things that big companies wouldn't even spend their time on. And so it's very, I'm just going to be honest, it's kind of exhausting as a small business to play that, to be in that ring. And so, you know, yeah, but to go, so pardon my sigh, because you're right. It is it is the space, it is the real estate, it is the energy. But what I love about what you do is you're doing it in a way that is telling a true story. It's communicating, building rapport, relationship, which is different than the billboard or the commercial. So, and I see the connection to the poetry for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it helps like even to help come up with themes or to help like understand the journey of someone's emotions and how to lead people on a path where they can help feel something if your brand is trying to communicate a feeling.
Yeah. And so as we sort of end, a couple things like how can people find you? And what is something coming up that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, you can find me. I'm predominantly on Instagram at Miss D Bennett. And that is where I've been sharing a lot of old work, and I'll be sharing a lot more new work coming up pretty soon. I don't have anything in particular coming up, to be honest. I was teaching a couple classes over the pandemic for free just to give people an outlet and something fun to do. But as the world is starting to open up a little bit more, I am not doing that quite as much. But if I do have something coming up, I'll certainly announce it on Instagram.
Yeah. And if people do want to learn from you, are those online, or are they like just to keep an eye on future stuff?
I would say I don't update my website quite as much anymore. I will be honest with you, because I'm just not booking as many public events. I am open for bookings for private engagements. So I can do private classes. I can do private performances for your conference. I can do consulting and writing for also conferences, events, videos, those kind of things. But if I do have a public event where people can join, I'll be sure to share it on Instagram.
Awesome. I have a couple quick questions for you, and I want this to be like a little teaser for our interview that's going to be released this week. So my first question is, share with me a time that you feel like you made it.
I have to say, between two. The first memory that came to mind was I have gotten to perform in front of 10,000 people in New Zealand, and it felt incredibly powerful, and like a lot of work came home. And the second time was I got to perform in front of 5,000 people at the Dolby Theater, where they host the Academy Awards, which felt really fun.
That is so cool, and that must feel like massive crowds. 10,000 people, 5,000 people, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. Okay, and then I have to ask the inevitable question. Share with me a time where you felt like you'd never make it.
Just one. This is super honest for me. I went out for my local poetry community's slam team multiple times and felt really confident about it and didn't make it. And it was heart-wrenching.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
It was tough.
Yeah.
Tough love.
Yeah. And I don't even know what to say. All I can say is that I relate, because as an actress, I have heard no like so many times, and some really, really big things. Like I really, really thought I was going to be Belle on Broadway, and I didn't. I wasn't. I know. Okay, so Danielle, as our last question, what are you most proud of that you've made?
A healthy life.
I love that. Yeah.
A healthy life. It takes so much work and reprioritizing, and sometimes letting go of things that give you a quick hit or a quick fix and make you feel good. And so releasing some of those quick adrenaline or ego hits for the sake of deeper health and deeper personal satisfaction is what I'm most proud of that I am currently doing and trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. And I love that in our interview, you share some of the little tips and ways that you've done that for yourself. So I hope people listen in.
Yeah, me too. I hope they enjoy it.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thanks, Elle.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of She Made It. Our goal is to reach as many women as possible through this podcast to inspire them to find their truest, most creative selves. And we need your help. Apple Podcasts is way more likely to put our show on other people's radar if we have reviews. If you've enjoyed even just one episode of She Made It, we'd be so honored if you left a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. It's easiest to do this through the Apple Podcasts app on your phone, and if you're not sure how, just go to elzerman.com/review if you need some instructions. Thank you so much in advance. We cannot wait to hear from you.